Welcome to the first content slide presentation for Management 605. The reading for this week was from Kouzes and Posner on chapters 1, 2, and the epilogue. There are two parts of this I want to highlight. One is the 5 practices of exemplary leadership, which is model the way, inspire a shared vision, challenge the process, enable others to act, encourage the heart. Kind of a new theory of leadership, or it's a theory of leadership, exemplary leadership, that maybe runs against some traditional ideas of leadership, like that leaders are tough, or leaders are gruff, or authoritarian, or paternalistic, or so forth. In today's business world, this type of, enabling others to act, getting out of the way, but and inspire a vision, a shared vision, not a vision that the leader holds and followers don't initially. And also encourage the heart. What does that have to do with it? All leaders will need to do is make others follow them. So it's not an exercise of raw power, but rather an exercise of more encouragement and motivation. So I wanted to bring that. And Kouzes and Posner also have this idea of credibility theory of leadership. The credibility theory of leadership has 4 parts: that leaders need to be credible, and that good leaders or effective leaders have the 4 parts of credibility. 1, they're honest. 2, they're forward-looking. 3, they're competent. And 4, they're inspiring. Maybe inspiring is before competent. But the credibility theory of leadership is a good place to start. And let's compare it with some of the other ones. The credibility theory of leadership is actually let's see, it's a type of leadership. And theoretically, or maybe more academically, more abstract, what leadership is by definition, it's helping an organization to succeed. So I have a little diagram here and a definition which shows what I'm talking about. The credibility theory of leadership theory is actually an example of a competency theory. That leaders are born, not made, not quite right, but that what happens is durable characteristics of people explain leaders' success. So, something like being honest, or something like being forward-looking, or being competent, or being inspiring. These characteristics, if you have these characteristics, you will be a successful leader. If you don't have those characteristics, you won't be a successful leader. And it doesn't matter so much how a leader behaves that determines a leader's effectiveness. What matters is whether or not you have these. And it's a very popular way to look at theory of leadership. It's actually not so supported by the research, as I'll get into in a bit. But certainly, there's a distinction to be made too. Are characteristics such as honesty, forward-looking, inspiring, and competent, are they behaviors that you can change on a day-to-day basis, or are they durable characteristics? So let's assume they're durable characteristics. Well, they would be something like personality, self-concept as a leader, drive, integrity, leadership, motivation, intelligence, and emotional intelligence. We have studied those things, and we find that those characteristics do indeed associate with successful leadership. However, some problems, causality. Is it true that those characteristics then cause organizational success, or are they things that we grow into? If you take somebody, make that person a leader, and then and the organization succeeds, does that person then turn around and say, oh, I have a successful organization, now I need to behave like a leader? So what came first, the characteristics or the leadership position? Inflexibility. A lot of leaders are honest, that's true, or any other characteristic. But is it always true that honesty is always best? Sometimes a leader may want to be a little bit deceptive or a little bit strategic in the use of information? For example, would you tell your your employees one thing, and would you tell your shareholders another thing? Suppose you wanted to raise the price of your goods and make more money. Would you tell your shareholders that the money is going to go to buy back stock and increase stock price, or would you tell your employees that the money is going to go into increased wages and perks for them? Well, you might want to be a little bit fuzzy on that. So that inflexibility is questionable. Third, how do you weight among the competencies? Sure, credibility theory, you want to be all four, but what's more important? Is inspiring more important? Is competence more important? Is honesty more important? And the last problem is the competency theory is just looking at an individual. But we find that when we look at leadership, that it's not so much whether a leader has characteristics, but whether or not those leaders' characteristics fit well with other people in the firm. So that relational aspect is not included in the theory. So there are other theories that include these things, and let's go into theories that have fewer of these problems. The first theory of leadership I want to bring is the behavioral perspective on leadership. There will be a self-assessment on this with this week's activities. First of all, what the behavioral aspect says is that it's not so much an individual's personality or durable characteristics, but rather an individual's ability to behave in a certain way, a pattern of leadership behaviors, a leadership style. Or in other words, the pattern is not durable. In other words, you treat you appropriately as a leader, behave maybe with a very authoritative way in a conflict situation, but then maybe in a very relational way in another type of behavior when you have maybe a social situation or a different situation. So leadership style would be a pattern of leadership behaviors. And what the theory says is that, that these behaviors are very complex and can be very flexible, and that a good leader will be able to fit the leadership behaviors that are most appropriate. Now, the leader behaviors tend to fall into two types of styles. And again, leaders can adopt behaviors in different styles, but the theory says that leaders tend to have a preference for one type of style versus another type of style. The two types of styles are people-oriented and task-oriented. People-oriented basically says that that leaders are very much into the establishing trusting, deep relationships with people, and they show a lot of consideration for people, and that's important for motivating, especially from the heart type of leadership. Task-oriented styles are more focused on getting the job done, on meeting goals, and in a way sort of ignoring the emotional, interpersonal relationship aspect of leadership. Task-oriented leaders tend to be viewed as authoritarian. So we have two types of behaviors that are now defined. The self-assessment will do that. Now, the the big benefit of the behavioral perspective of leaders is the behavioral perspective explains why so many different types of personalities. So introverts, you think that introverts wouldn't be successful leaders. Well, introverts may not have the traits of many successful leaders, but introverts can certainly behave in an appropriate manner. Introverts can be people oriented or task oriented as is necessary, and there are many successful leaders who are introverts. And as a matter of fact, I think Lincoln would be an introvert. And you can go through a lot of those traits and and say, well, even if you don't have this trait, you can still behave in an appropriate way to again lead to organizational success. One of the problems of the behavioral theory of leadership is to figure out when to use a certain behavioral style. So, if a people oriented leader might be very good at running a PTA or running a very successful organization or a government agency, but a people oriented leader may not be very effective at managing in a crisis situation or managing in a situation where the leader is not respected very much by followers, or a situation where dire sacrifice is necessary. Maybe an authoritative leader is good in those. So, how do we specify the contingencies or the situations where a leadership style would be effective? Now, the path goal theory, leadership theory, is the best theory we have. It's pretty complex, so I'm only going to sketch it, but it's a pretty good description of what we need as a leader, of what determines organizational success and leaders' roles in it. So, the leadership styles are, according to path goal theory, can be four types, not just people oriented, not just task oriented, but directive, something like task oriented; supportive, something like people oriented; participative, that means leaders sort of like delegate and allow others to take the lead at some point; and achievement oriented. Achievement oriented has been described as a very aggressive type of leadership, where you're constantly taking a very maybe a very capable employee and stretching that employee, giving that employee jobs that are maybe beyond what the employee thought he or she could do, and they're thereby, you know, accelerating the development of that employee. So if you're stretching your employees, that's an achievement oriented behavior. So there's four types of behaviors or leadership styles. Now, the, the, the challenge of a leader is to match the behavior with the contingency. Now, there are two contingencies identified in the path goal theory. The first is environmental. So, task structure. So, does the leader have the authority to actually change followers' behaviors? Or in other words, does a leader have authority in the legitimate authority within the firm? Many times, leaders are given a job without being given any extra authority to get that job done. That makes the task that makes the task structure very, very weak. On the other hand, a leader may have full control over performance bonuses, over hiring and firing, and over everything about the employees. That would be a high task structure, a very good task structure. Second is team dynamics. So, is the team a changing team, or is it a is it a stable team? A team with a lot of turnover and and changes will be a more challenging team to situation to deal with. All right, contingency 2 is employees. The first dimension is skill expertise. So, does your team have the skills necessary to complete the job? If yes, then that's going to be a fairly straightforward job of leadership. But if no, now you have another leadership challenge. You have employees who aren't really up to the job of doing this, and motivating or getting those employees to successfully complete the task, complete the mission is a big challenge. Second is locus of control. Do the employees have internal locus of control? Do they feel that they have control over their success? Or do they think that success is determined by other factors, by like the environment or by whether the customer agrees or some external factor? Again, the challenge for leadership is very different. So let's go to the next slide and look and see how path goal leadership theory works. Here's a diagram of path goal theory. Now, organizational success, the far right picture, can be measured by motivation, satisfaction, or leader acceptance. Those are all measures that lead to organizational performance. You might want to argue about that, but these are pretty much associated with that. On the far left, leadership behaviors that we sort of like described. Now, what determines organizational success? Well, the leader has to adapt a behavior, and there are 4 options, to fit the employee contingencies at the top here, the skill expertise, and to fit the environmental contingencies, the task structure and team dynamics. Now, there's a 4 by 2 by 2, 16 different possibilities here of behaviors that fit with contingencies, employee contingencies, and environmental contingencies. Each of those 16 combinations could fit the organizational success. But it's not even that simple. There are different combinations of leadership behaviors that might fit with certain contingencies. So the model gets to be very complex, and when you think about it. In spite of those difficulties, though, this model has been tested and it has been shown to explain a significant amount of organizational success, and as I said before, it's the best we got. As complex as path goal theory is, as I said, it's a good one, and it's consistent with other ideas of leadership that we have out there. A lot of students that I've taught in the past are very much into servant leadership. That the job of leaders is not to command or dominate the others in the organization. Rather, servant leaders put themselves at a par or even as a serving kind of a profile with followers. And they take the role of coaches, stewards, facilitators. And of course, the ultimate kind of like example of this is maybe a religious figure like a Jesus or something, the ultimate servant. And the appeal of servant leadership is humility. And there's something about human nature that maybe humility is a very desirable trait, and that humility is consistent with good values, honesty, trustworthiness, and the like. And and again, servant leadership is very effective. Consistent with path goal theory, servant leadership is sort of you could describe it as a series of behaviors that enable followers to do the right thing, to be the best they can be. Another leadership idea is the so-called transactional leadership. In transactional leadership, Leaders clarify the goals, arrange employees to obtain resources, link rewards with performance. So it's again kind of a servant leadership approach, but the path goal theory would say that this is what leaders do. They sort of like arrange for followers the best leadership that is necessary for getting the employees to obtain rewards. And again, path goal theory, let's see, with the exception of the directive leadership behaviors, the transactional leadership is perfectly consistent with the path goal theory. The idea of transformational leadership challenges path goal theory, and it challenges the transactional leadership idea. With transformational leadership, the idea here is that followers act irrationally. In other words, if you're working for an organization and you're getting paid a certain amount, it would be rational to put a certain amount of work in and maybe not work on weekends or nights or stress yourself out trying to do a very good job really when there's no reward for it. When a leader can inspire followers to work harder than they should given the rewards of the job, then we have an example of transformational leadership. And transformation, by definition, leaders drive the relationship with followers by communicating a vision and inspiring them to achieve it. So the idea of driving is sort of in the path goal theory, but it's not one of the assumptions. It sort of this transformational leadership goes outside because you're going outside the assumed rationality of followers. So transformational leadership is this idea that leaders do more than support followers. They command the trust, loyalty, and efforts of followers. And indeed, we see in anecdotes and even in Lincoln, somehow, even though Lincoln's sort of a laid-back leader, he was still able to transform followers by commanding the trust, loyalty, and efforts. Transformational leadership is probably necessary in a lot of very difficult situations to get something done. So it's a useful approach to leadership. It's a useful idea, and therefore I include it in this show. A very interesting extension of the leadership theory, and perhaps a complement to transformational leadership, is this idea of implicit leadership. You can have a situation where leaders thinking they are in charge is actually counterproductive, especially maybe in some contingencies. If you have an organization that is very competent, an organization that automatically functions well, understands the mission, understands the values, then a leader doesn't have to be very heavy-handed at all. And as a matter of fact, there are some scholars say that leadership is sort of a chimera. Leadership is not really a real aspect of organizations. Rather, it's followers that determine the characteristics of a leader. So, for example, if we see a leader with leadership behaviors like authoritarian, and the organization is very successful, well, the reason that may be true is that the organization's values produce an authoritarian leader. And if a leader acted in some way that was not authoritarian, followers would give negative feedback. They'd stop working. They'd not get motivated. They wouldn't come to work on time, whatever. Forcing the leader to adopt the behaviors that the followers need. Well, if that's the case, then the causal relationship is reversed. It's not the leader that is responsible for the success of the organization, it's really the followers. And the leadership style is implicit in the values and behaviors of the followers. I think that covers the points on this slide. I like this idea of a dance. Successful leadership is a dance between leaders and followers. Who's in charge? That's the idea of causality. It's a major challenge to leadership, that leadership theory, that it's not the leaders that cause the change, but the followers. Then the challenge of organizations isn't so much to get and develop leaders, but to get and develop an organization that has a culture and values that will engender effective leadership. Something to think about, and it might be right, at least in part. So, in sum, these theories of leadership show that leadership is a complex process and we don't understand it well. But we do have a theory, the Pascal theory, that works. We have some contrasting ideas of how leadership works, and I want you to be familiar with all of them. The bottom line is that everyone can be a leader. Chapter 1 of Kouzes and Posner. We are all leaders, probably in some way, because our presence in an organization affects the success of that organization. It's probably good advice, I would argue, to follow the 5 practices of exemplary leadership that I mentioned in the first slide, because as we'll talk about later, in today's organizations, in developed economies, where our value added has to be very high per person, it's very important for all members of an organization to be inspired, to show initiative, to show creativity, and to show passion. You can't do that. You cannot get other people to passion if you're a dominant leader and you've managed to suppress dissent in your organization. If a leader has the idea of suppressing dissent, you're not going to have the effective organization for a developed economy. It's very useful, I think, to look at Lincoln's example. He's an unlikely leader, and we'll talk about that in next week's motivational talk. But Lincoln was not a dominating person. He managed to inspire thousands of people to fight for his cause. He took a legislature, a government that was all in favor of letting the South secede, and he opposed that and got the North to fight for the Union. And he wasn't even anyone's first choice to be president. There was a candidate from the North, a candidate from the South, and Lincoln was from Illinois in the West. He wasn't even the first choice. But somehow he was in the right place at the right time, and my gosh, he certainly changed the world. So he's an example worth emulating, and we'll get to him next week. Thank you for your attention.